guess if you were like me, you kind of spent that week in between Christmas and New Year's kind of in a fog, in a bit of a haze, right? See, I feel like most of the year, you always know what day of the week it is, but you don't really know the date. And then I feel like for the last week of the year, you don't know what day of the week it is, but you just kind of know the date because you're like, when is New Year's? Like how many days? It's like countdown to New Year's. And then always, like our food habits change a lot at that last week of the year. Like, I don't know if you're like me, there's always just like a pile of old cheese and you're like, oh, I just keep nibbling at it. At a certain point, cookies become an acceptable breakfast item. You watch all this football that you do not even care about, right? You're like, how many college bowl games can I watch? And I don't know. And it's nice, right? It's nice to just hang around and relax and kind of exhale the year prior. But then, of course, that level of kind of relaxation, it runs its course, and you start thinking about the year ahead. You start thinking about who you want to be in the year ahead, maybe how you want to feel in the year ahead. And really, the question that we start asking is, how am I going to navigate 2025 as a spiritual person, right? Or as a person oriented towards growth? What am I going to bring into this new year? And what am I willing to leave behind in 2024? And really, the question that we're asking ourselves is, how am I willing to think about rebooting my life in this next year? What am I willing to reset and let be rebooted? Now, reboot is, of course, a term that relates to technology. But how many of you know that rebooting is like the most effective thing you could do if you ever have issues with any of your devices, right? Like, I'll give you a pro tip. If you did not know this, just turn it off and turn it on again. I promise you it'll work. We don't know how or why this happens, but it works. It's actually true with us as human beings, right? With our bodies, right? If you get stressed out, just take a nap, turn it off, turn it on again, and you're good to go. But this idea of rebooting as this technological fix, I don't think just applies to us at the consumer level. I think people who fix computers for a living also know this. Like, are there any IT people out there? Anybody? There's no, okay. So if you're being honest, how often in your day-to-day are you actually just helping people turn stuff on and off again? Yeah? Okay, I got 2 thumbs up, okay? Now, I thought about this, and I thought, man, if this is the case, we must be spending a lot more money than we realize on simply rebooting computers. So I did a little bit of a calculation for you. Okay, so let's just assume that there are 55 million IT workers in the world, and that let's just be extremely conservative and imagine that they just spend around 10 minutes a day helping people turn computers or phones on and off again. Divide that by 60 minutes an hour by what we might just imagine is an average global rate of $25 an hour. That's $29 million a day, over 250 working days a year. That is $57.25 billion every year spent on turning computers on and off again. Just let that sink in, okay? Now, why do I tell you this? The idea of the reset or the reboot, it is universal, right? It is universal in our lives, but it is also an image of something that we engage in our own personal experiences. See, friends, I think any time that we're willing to rethink the way that we relate to something, we're willing to reboot a practice or a dynamic in our life, that we're engaging in this kind of work. Think for a second about the idea of, say, a fast, right? Like, if anyone's ever fasted, maybe particularly from food, what you understand is not only is there this biological reset happening in your body, but also mentally, you're rethinking your relationship with food. If you go without food for a couple of days, you actually realize the level of brain power that food is taking up, that even when you're not eating, you're thinking about your next meal. So it's this opportunity to renegotiate that relationship. I think of meditation in many ways as a fast of your thoughts, right? We're simply taking some time and space to sit and reset our relationship to our own minds. And so there's this interesting dynamic where in our spiritual traditions, there is a lot of encouragement to engage in practices like fasting or meditating. And I think it's because really it's important to think about this opportunity to reset our relationship to different things in our lives. And the reality is, friends, there are some relationships that are evolving quite fast in our world. And what I want to talk about today is really our relationship to technology and how this has changed the way that we relate to information. And this has really wildly transformed the way that we connect to one another and really connect to ourselves and our own emotions. And you might be out there and you might say, well, I feel pretty good about my relationship to technology. You'd probably be in the minority for sure. But if you do feel good and feel like, wow, I'm in total balance with my relationship to technology, I would say good for you. However, we are in a world that is ever changing and continuing to kind of co-evolve with technology in a really fascinating way. And I think it's just important for us to have these conversations. And so I want to start with a quote from the author Sherry Turkle, who writes in her book, Reclaiming Conversation, "We are being overwhelmed with information, but our capacity for empathy, reflection, and human connection isn't growing to match." How many of us have heard this term, the information age? That in many ways, the age of history that we are living in as a society is the information age. It is marked by the availability and the accessibility of more information than has ever been available in all of human history. And yet we must begin to ask ourselves, is all this information good for me? Is it all useful? You can open your phone at any time of day and see what's going on with someone on the other side of the world, or you can see which celebrity said what dumb thing, or you could see what your college roommate had for breakfast. But there's a problem, or there's a cost to this onslaught of information. And the reality is that our minds are not developed for all the information that we take in on a daily basis. It's almost as if the speed at which technology has developed and the speed at which our brains have developed are just not matching. They're not in sync, right? It's like if you ever as someone who has been a musician and has been in my fair share of like train wreck situations as a band, if you've ever seen what you call a train wreck when it comes to music, it's usually because you have two musicians playing totally out of tempo with one another, right? Like they're playing two different songs. And yet this is what has happened with human development and technology. We're just out of sync. And the reality is we don't even need to worry about who's to blame for all this. That's a rabbit hole you can go down if you want. But in reality, what I want to encourage us to think about today is, are we willing to rethink how we consume information? Are we willing to rethink what amount of information is useful and then what amount is harmful? What we determine as our own level of emotional and spiritual health is going to look different for each and every one of us, but it's so important for us to just be curious and question, what is spiritually healthy for me when it comes to my relationship with technology? Eckhart Tolle says, the human mind is a wonderful servant, but a terrible master. The internet amplifies this truth. It distracts us unless we remain conscious. And I know that that's what we want. We want to be conscious. We want to engage with these tools that are parts of all of our lives, but we want to do it in a way that is conscious. And so what are we going to do? We're going to consider rethinking our relationship to information, but we also might reconsider our relationship to others and how that's changed in this modern era. See, because of social media, every single day, we interact with, or at least we observe people we know, people we kind of know, and then people we don't know at all, right? And what do all these people have in common? Well, they're having more fun than you. They're traveling a lot more than you. They have better friends than you, better spouses. They're more fit than you. They make more money than you. And for some weird reason, they're all rubbing it in, right? I don't know. And yet, despite all this, we have to ask ourselves, why do we not feel this sense of having meaningful relationships and meaningful connections, especially with the increase in the amount of people we're available to? It doesn't necessarily correspond to the amount of meaning that we've added to our lives, right? And the reality is, it's quite possible that we've exceeded our capacity for how many meaningful relationships we as human beings are capable of having. Evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar has theorized that there is a specific number of meaningful relationships that we as human beings are biologically wired to have, and that number is 150. And that number is called the Dunbar number, and Dunbar writes about this: the limit imposed by the Dunbar number is not about technology or physical space. It's about the wiring of our brains. Our capacity for meaningful social relationships is bounded by our biology. It's a new field that I've invented today, biology. But the reality is, friends, is that we have this physical capacity to have roughly 150 meaningful relationships, and yet we try to have much, much more than that. And it isn't technology or even space that limits us. It's simply our biology, our biology. So if you're like me, your Dunbar number doesn't always feel like 150. Sometimes it feels like 12, right? Like you can probably handle like 12 people. But the reality is, if you want a picture of what 150 people looks like, then Aldea as a community is a good example. Now, there's not 150 people in this room today, but really week to week in a given period of, let's say, a month, we do see about 150 unique faces. And that's just a good example of really we are wired to be in local community. We are wired to be in relationship with people who are right in front of us, right? People we can actually know. And when we go beyond this capacity of our brains, things get a little messy, right? Which is perhaps why we are the most connected we've ever been as a world, and yet also the most lonely we've ever been in society. And yet the Dunbar number, it's interesting, it lets us off the hook, right? Because we can stop trying to have thousands of meaningful relationships and instead focus on the meaning in the ones we already have. And so I would just ask, are you willing to rethink and really reprioritize the relationships that truly matter in your life and place less emphasis on pseudo relationships that you have with celebrities and people you follow and people you don't really know? Because if we pull emphasis away from those relationships and those people who we're so often comparing ourselves to, we might realize how great our lives are and how great the relationships we actually have are, right? And so we're willing to rethink our relationship to information, rethink our relationship to people. And the last one is a little interesting, but I think you'll relate to it as we unpack it. I want us to rethink our relationship to outrage. See, when it comes to social media, when it comes to the news, there is this new term that you might be familiar with that really is a definition of how we consume information in the modern era. And this term is outrage culture. And basically, the idea behind outrage culture is that the way that we experience the flow of information is that there is always something new to be angry at, right? And now, if we're being honest, how many of us, when we interact with social media, when we interact with the news, it's a lot of, how dare they? Or, gosh, I just can't believe that they said that. Or, the world just seems to be on fire, right? And it's a lot of anger and big, heavy emotions. Jaron Lanier wrote in his book, 10 Arguments for Deleting Your Social Media Accounts Right Now, writes, social media amplifies the worst in us because outrage is its most profitable emotion. The algorithms don't care about truth, they care about engagement. Now, why is it that negativity is more profitable than positivity? Well, for starters, we as human beings just have this tendency to notice and prioritize negative information more than positive. If we're being honest, this is true of our lives every single day, that negative information stands out a lot more than positive information. It's been said that positive things that happen in your day are like Teflon. They just slide right off, and negative things are more like Velcro. And if we're being honest, right, like you could have 10 great things happen in your day and one bad thing happens, and that's what you remember. You know, I'll walk off stage and, you know, I'll have 5 people who will be really nice and complimentary, and they'll say, hey, that was a great message today. And then one person will be like, yeah, Jake, it was just a little too long. And I'll be like, everyone hates me. I'm going to move to Canada. Like, this is terrible. But the reality is, we all know this, right? We're wired as human beings to perceive threats. It's part of our survival. It's actually part of our evolution. It's how we have developed, right? But yet we still have this tendency to overemphasize the threats and the negative things in our environment. I'll give you an example. When it comes to animals, right? Like, here's my dog, Josie, right? And she has never experienced any kind of threat in her life because we've just, all day long, we just protect her from threats. And so this is how she lays. She lays on her back with her stomach exposed because she never feels any danger or the need to protect herself. You've probably never seen a coyote lay like this, right? And it's because coyotes are wild animals and they're more vigilant. And yet, here's the reality. We, as human beings, we act a lot more like coyotes than we act like Josie because we still have that survival mentality. And the reality is that the systems at play when it comes to technology, they take advantage of this fact that we have this mentality. Tristan Harris, who is a tech ethicist, says that outrage spreads 6 times faster than joy on social media. It's not because people are angrier than ever. It's because the systems are designed to reward it. Now, this sounds discouraging, or this might sound a little daunting, but I actually find this to be a little comforting because if you read between the lines, it's not that people are angrier than ever. Friends, maybe it's not that the world is worse than it's ever been or that people are angrier than they've ever been. Perhaps it's just that it's intended to look that way. Yes, we are divided. Yes, we are polarized, but it also benefits the powers that be in the system to create this image of division, an image of polarization, so that when we engage online, very differently than we do in the real world, when we engage online, we focus on our differences and the rage induced by our differences rather than letting those differences stand and understand that we have differences, right? And so what happens? Well, we tend to live in this world now where we think that the most responsible way that we can be is outraged all the time. We look at this world and we think the most responsible way of responding to all that's going on in the world is to be angry. And now, friends, hear me very clearly. I am not saying that there are not things to be outraged at. I'm not saying that there are not injustices, many injustices that we need to really allow ourselves to feel what we feel, and anger is often the right response. The question that I'm asking today is, what is our highest motivating emotion? When has outrage taken over love, right? Have we let love, or have we let outrage come before love as our motivating emotion and the motivating way that we approach these different situations and dynamics in our world? James Baldwin, he explores this in a way that I think is really helpful. You cannot fix everything that is wrong in a society by screaming at it. Outrage without action or introspection is merely performative anger. I want to really hone in on this phrase, outrage without action or introspection. It's not that outrage itself is a problem. It's outrage without being reflective about healing, outrage without being reflective about unity or reconnection. So perhaps when we're talking about outrage culture, this is what we're talking about. Simply yelling at one another without asking ourselves, how can I actually participate in something better? Or how have I been a part of this? Can I be introspective about my own role in all of this? Brene Brown says that outrage culture uses shame as a weapon, but it doesn't build connection or foster understanding. It creates walls, not bridges. What has happened as a result of all this anger bubbling up in our world? Well, we've experienced a new dynamic as a response to outrage culture that has been called outrage fatigue. How many of us can relate to this, that when we look at the way and the nature of the discourse in our world today and how angry people are and how volatile social media and the news can be, sometimes our response is just, I'm done. I need a break, right? I need to just step away from it all. How many of us have felt that way in some form or another? And now, friends, it's not to say, again, that there are not many things in this world that are worth our anger, right? That are worth our natural feeling of justice and feeling like there are things that we need to do. But really the question is, has our anger come at the cost of our own grounding, right? Or our own joy? See, last month, we talked about this ancient Hebrew concept of tikkun olam, and how this phrase roughly translates to the repairing of the world. And it's really this invitation that we are all participants in the ongoing healing of our world, of restoring and repairing the brokenness that exists in our world. And saying that we might be experiencing some outrage fatigue is in no way saying that we are giving up on tikkun olam. In fact, it's really just asking, is outrage the best and most effective and most productive approach to the healing of the world? Or perhaps is there better fuel for this work, right? Is there a better way to approach this work of unifying and healing the divide? And what are some frameworks that we might use when thinking about a better way? Perhaps we might consider an approach that is more emphasis on building than tearing down. I love what Tolstoy says, do not destroy what you cannot replace. Don't tear something down if you can't build something more productive in its stead. How about this? Using love as our fuel rather than hate. As Dr. King said, darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. So the amplification of more and more anger isn't going to make the hate go away. We must fill it with love. And perhaps lastly, we might consider listening before being quick to speak and interject our opinion. As Gandhi said, speak only if it improves upon the silence. Okay? Or, as your mom said, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. And so what's happened? Well, we're looking at a world right now that has more information than ever before, and yet it doesn't necessarily make us smarter. We have access to more people than we ever have, and yet it doesn't necessarily make us more fulfilled. And we are more outraged than we've ever been, and yet it doesn't necessarily translate to us healing the world together. And so the question I have for you today is, are we willing to reboot the system? And are we willing to reboot it in our own lives to create that better world, right? And I'm not asking you to give up on technology or give it all up, right? It's just not feasible in this world that we live in. And the reality is I'd love to see what Amish Aldea would look like, but I just don't, it's not coming anytime soon, right? No, I'm not asking you to give up technology. I'm inviting you to think about rebooting your relationship to it and to be curious about what that might look like for you, right? So that we could be engaged without being outraged. We can be informed without being overwhelmed. And we can have all this access and be connected, but at the same time still grounded. I want to close with this quote from Alan Watts. He says, technology extends our reach, but cannot replace the joy of living simply, fully, and presently. Aldea, as we begin this new year, would we be willing to reboot our lives, and would we be willing to reset our habits? As we interact with our ever-changing world, will we not forget to be intentional about figuring out what healthy, right, spiritually healthy, emotionally healthy, what it looks like for you, what it looks like for me? And may we prioritize the relationships that matter. May we prioritize joy even when there's things to be angry about. Because there is truly no greater joy than living simply, fully, and presently.